Hello everyone, today we talk about the 12th century Western European infantryman, even though it's not really just about infantry, nor about any specific type of infantryman, aside from some examples that we will throw in here and there for the sake of iconographical reference, which I understand is very important. By the way, all the pictures that I use, as you know, are Creative Commons. You can find them and use them with proper attribution yourself. They're not so straightforward to find because most of them are under the relative names that here I have in front of me now in the folder, but that in fact you should have a list of. I have all the links at the end of the video, as you know. There are also many models online that are, however, unfortunately copyrighted. We're talking about figurines from, say, wargaming, publishing, and stuff like that. Actually, it's plenty, if you Google, there's plenty of artists' work that is public to see but not to reuse. So that's another story. I don't know any YouTube channel that does what I do in terms of research of such iconographic pieces for every single video that I make. I choose only the very specific image pertaining to that era, to that century. Like, I don't exceed. This brought me far as far. I didn't have that iconographic culture before I started Schwerpunkt, but over the years now I can recognize lots of things just out of sheer practice. Now, I've already made similar videos. This is for the historical military units series. I made, for example, 13th century Western European infantry. We talk about Western European knights. There is all an evolution there. We will continue with it. We don't individually upload new videos for each because, as you know, it's part of a broader cycle. But as you know, I plan to complete more or less the entire landscape of warfare at some point, time allowing. I'm on that track, and so it is. Now, how to conceptualize a topic like this? It's not that easy because we're talking mostly about arms and armor. As you understand, this varied. We could even speak about an average prototype, but at the end of the day, we kind of more or less know what we're talking about. Infantry was normally segmented just like cavalry, with an elite of heavily armored troops that normally form the anterior ranks, also for a shock effect, depending especially on which military culture we're discussing, because there were some parts of Europe, especially in its fringe, that relied more on infantry than cavalry. And as we will understand now, the 12th century, especially the first half, is still pretty conservative and primitive in many ways. Cavalry is definitely the upper arm since the mid-6th century, but it's not the decisive one yet. Instead, roughly in Western Europe between 1150 and 1300, infantry is not seen winning by itself, meaning that even though there are, as we'll also discuss today, especially towards the end in part, some infantry that took on cavalry on their own and were incredibly resilient and were capable of even reforming after being broken by a cavalry charge, etc. They weren't decisively beating cavalry, were essentially assisted, which is exceptional in this cases, by cavalry that would be, in this sense, decisive, knocking out their counterpart, because otherwise the infantry alone was not thought to be that relevant. Of course, as we just said, if in the fringe this was not the case, it's not because infantry was tougher. On the contrary, compared to the areas where cavalry was stronger, we're talking Western Europe here, so it's that familiar Frankish sedentary world of Latin Germanic ancestry. The fringe is mostly Celtic, or in some other areas. Well, there are we're talking about Baltic countries. Just recently I made a video about that, but at least those are a bit, both of these places are taken over by, of course, some sort of Frankish forces broadly meant. But of course in their warfare, since cavalry is scarce, infantry is relevant in those relative terms. When they have to face Western heavy cavalry, they more than else get out of the way. They take refuge in the forests. They form barricades. They do not meet the enemy in open ground. That's why this fringe is colonized by this broader Frankish civilization, and the hinterland, the swampy forested hinterland, remains in the hands of these more primitive populations. As I was just previewing, at the end of the video we'll make some broader considerations about the value of Western European infantry in its relative art of war over the time. Today we're not focusing too much on the Crusades, but as you understand, there are instances in the East where infantry, especially at this point, think about the Battle of Arsuf or other important engagements, we've seen the Battle of Atten, etc., like, where you can see the importance of infantry against armies that had often more cavalry than infantry, like the Seljuk ones of the Middle East. But at large we will stay within not just the range of arms and armor, but also the geographical ones of Western Europe. I don't remember whether I already made specifically 12th century infantry units videos, but you can find all of that in the 12th century playlist in the infantry playlist, so they overlap, and in any case I made so many that you will surely find something and we will add on that. But the difficulty of this video is describing a bit the whole range of forces. By the way, we're not just discussing heavy infantry, we're talking also missile. Of course, there will be other military historical units videos in which we will talk about quite particular types of infantrymen that are singled out from this list. In fact, I will not mostly include them, not to spoil the surprise. However, still showing how, in fact, wide the array of infantry types at large could be that Moro was talking about before. Like, there is the heavily armored element that we will also discuss today together with the less armored one, but at large, like a metal helmet, some padded armor, spear, shield, side weapon, is the basic, at least heavy infantry armament. 12th century Europe is still, again, very archaic in many ways, but of course there is a bit more wealth and general development of also the military systems at large, armies organization. You can start seeing a more tendentially specialized and quasi-professional outlook that these forces represent at large. Because in general, when we talk about medieval warfare, there is this cliche that I personally never indulged in, that basically says, well, but the majority of troops was made up of peasants, right? Which is technically not a cliche, at least when it's not connected with the idea that most armies of the period would be essentially made up of rabble forces. On the contrary, civilizationally speaking, there was, as you know, since ever, practically a rota system of sorts that tended, even at that sort of farmer, peasant levy level, tended to functionalize a better type of fighter, could be, say, roughly drilled and, in fact, equipped for a functional purpose on the battlefield. It was not the rabble. This included, like, the better men of the community, the accumulated wealth, let's say, contribution that was provided in order to arm him. Plus, the 12th century is, as you know, the moment in which the so-called national monarchies are essentially affirming themselves, they're taking shape, and as such, there is essentially this embryonal level of statal control on the armed force and the population that starts tending towards some more recognizably public level of army organization. There isn't a major difference across the various lands in Europe. Basically, we fought all in the same way at the time. There's no notable exception. You can look at different sort of shades. There is something ethnic. I don't know, think about Spanish armies having more, those are cavalry, but at large it would have been true also for infantry, more a la jineta kind of fighters, some slightly lighter bias, for example. You can find a bit less cavalry in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom compared to the Western Frankish Kingdom. Apparently England had some taste for still more foot troops, or at least this was determined by the different level of wealth like across the country. The Midlands were a bit more primitive and poor and relied mostly on the older sort of Anglo-Danish because, by the way, as you know, the Normans inherited part of the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Danish military system. They just on top installed a fully feudal one. The Italians on average have a stronger infantry than the other countries we'll talk about later. Flanders does have interesting experimentations against knights to a degree, even though it's a more bourgeois and less tendentially politically organized phenomenon. The French dominate essentially in terms of cavalry quality. This is the center of the spread of crossbows at large, especially coming from France, Italy. These are the places where it wasn't born at this time. Crossbows existed since antiquity everywhere in Europe, even though they're relatively scarcely documented. But I mean, if you can find this in iconographic sources of 9th century Pictland, you understand. They were present pretty much everywhere. There are all these kind of considerations we could make. However, let's get to some specific examples. Could include even some late 11th century, but at large, starting from the beginning of the period, there are very interesting capital sculptures that I also inserted in the video, featuring Occitanian forces from Vézelay. There are very beautiful depictions of Englishmen from the so-called Bury Bible, which dates approximately to 1121. I couldn't use much of these. I couldn't even find them because they're copyrighted, and some elements are more granted through some kind of Wikimedia Commons license. But I also, by Googling them, I can't find it. They're just not published or much, so I couldn't insert them. There are some interesting figures of Germans and of Southern Italians in Pietro d'Eboli's Carmen de Rebus Siculis, representing mostly the Hohenstaufen after the marriage with the Hauteville and all the wars that Henry VI fought in the Kingdom of Sicily, roughly around 1197. That is a pretty rich pool of information about very different units, including, the famed Thuringian archers that will, for example, be one of our military historical unit video. Even though, as you understand, say conceptually speaking, it's not like that Thuringian archer would be different compared from any archer, say, in the rest of Germany, in this rest of Western Europe. But in that instance, they are represented in a particular way, and so you can sort of characterize and stereotype them, because essentially, the leitmotif of this series is that more or less from a strictly military point of view, practically speaking, whether a guy was armed and armored in a slightly different way, nothing really changes. There are some fundamentals in terms of, as we explained before, like sort of mostly heavy and lighter, not much about the armoredness. That, of course, does play an important role, but that is also a level. But say the difference between heavy and light, that is generally at this point, in fact, missile infantry, is a very important aspect of the story. Consider this: during the Middle Ages, you don't find aside from these ethnic fringes, much skirmishers, like at least in the ancient world. Right, in the ancient world, you had a general segmentation of the levy that, as you know, from Rome to the Central European tribes, contemplated an important screen, like properly a class of recruitment made up just of those who could equip themselves with javelins. In the Middle Ages, especially starting from this point, you don't find too much of that comparatively. In fact, in some Latin sources of the period, the velitas, that, as you know, in the ancient Roman, Polybian legion, and also the old Camillian one, represented the skirmishers, actually mean crossbowmen, right? And so if you wonder where those guys went, there is an interesting change, not just in the type of weapon, but also in the different level of performance. For example, if you look at the organics that we will discuss in separate videos of crossbowmen at this time, especially in the places that tended to make more specialization of them. You know that in England, for example, Richard Lionheart was credited with having introduced them, even though they already existed there again since ever, but say from France, Italy, where we also have better documentation about it, realize that crossbowmen are good, but few, right? There are few companies that are assigned to the other mostly heavy infantry one, and this makes you think, because it says like these are actually light forces, like the crossbow technology is also relatively widespread. So the question is, why not more of them, right? And a great part of the reason rests in the fact that, of course, the decisive element is the heavy component, cavalry and infantry alike, and that therefore having some missile troops can be important, because we're looking mostly at combined arm tactics since ever in the art of war, but the missile element is not what you win battles with. And so having, for example, this elite, tendentially semi-professional at this point, crossbowman is quite an interesting point. There are, at this point, by the way, still, especially in the first half of the century, bowmen and longbowmen in any of the countries that we're looking at today. As you know, the longbow is a weapon characterized just by the bigger size of the simple self-bow. That is the only type you find in Western Europe since ever. It is bigger just because the guys who used them were bigger, and or would later, especially in the later Middle Ages, tendentially be specialized and selected in that fashion, meaning the bigger hunter normally had a bigger bow. Longbows are a prerogative of all of these people. There are beautiful pictures that are, now that I think about, I would insert also from, but I think that is even from the 13th, from some, because I'm thinking about the sources the pictures that you're seeing here that I could find also from other pools by now. I really collected a lot of these pictures that are extremely pertinent to the period. There was a big deal of leather or kilted armor. There is an endless controversy regarding the extent of leather, so the spread of leather armor. There are some YouTubers that do not get anything about the medieval art of war right, but they fixate with this kind of details that, as explained before, are also relatively irrelevant. Probably, this is an important historical topic, but it's so overtly represented it would kill one another for this kind of things. Leather armor was probably not conventionally widespread as a type of armor in general. Padded plus metal really is a great complement at large, but the problem also for padded armor is that any organic material tendentially is lost to the ages, and even when we get to find some of it surviving for some reason, it can be useful in a sort of structural material sense to show us how they would do things, but it still doesn't provide any per se any quantitative statistic datum about the general use, like the degree by which it was used at large. You can't make the case that, of course, finding some of it still does provide you with a general sense of how more or less spread it could be. In any case, if anything, we'll talk better about leather armor in a dedicated video. Kilted armor in particular is proven to absorb a whole load of blows of any kind, like cuts, piercing. Most of those were already spent, especially from missile weapons, not at the right angle, etc. That you will not be spared from being butchered down like a ham if you're encountering, as we'll see now, some weapons, including the ones you're wielding yourself close range in melee. But you will be saved from a lot of kind of nuisances, just thanks to a fundamentally cheap type of armor. As we were saying before, the degree of metal armoredness varied. Like, most troops at this point, of course, were not armored. Like, you can argue that by the 15th century there is a peak of armoredness, not much just because of the advancement in it from one side, but literally because of in terms of distribution, due to the fact that 15th century warfare tends to be dramatically more elite and professional compared to these previous years, in which many bourgeois, many peasants actually have a very important role in combat, but of course they cannot afford a great deal of metal protection. As a consequence, most troops will actually be protected in this way. These are also the troops that will tendentially make more and better use of shields, at least for themselves. I will not now digress in the apological comparisons with knights, but of course, like, the better armored, the less relevant the shield is going to be for you, reason for which, as you know, by the 13th century you have knightly shields that are essentially smaller, triangular, whereas you find infantry shields like the pavises that are spreading. Essentially the reason is going to be mostly the same, even though in the 13th century there was more metal armor around than in the previous era, and also a bit more professionalism already kicking in. But in the 12th century, especially in the first half, you have still a lot of militia levy mindset in many countries in Western Europe. Numbers are more important than armor, way more important than armor and numbers is quality, is training, is experience, is discipline, is professionalism, and that is what knights have. Today we will actually talk about dismounted knights, or knights that would also just decide to fight on foot for whichever reason. Since the beginning of the battle, we have seen it in different battles already. Those do make the difference. Those are the guys that can actually get into melee without much of pole arms or shields, or the bigger shields at least, because they are protected enough and they can close in the enemy, taking blows differently from the majority of these other guys that are not armored enough and have to keep the enemy at a distance. Naturally, they would also aggress them quite physically. Lots of knights were cut down in horrendous ways throughout all in a very physically sort of wrestling approach. Nevertheless, and just you can't be that bold or berserk to attack a knight, say, as you'll see now, with a double-handed axe, for example, and not much armor on, and destroy a knight, even though it's not very usual. shields could be of many different sizes and shapes. We mostly look at the kite shape, sort of Norman drop shield, that is quite popular for both cavalry and infantry from quite a long time. And it's around the 10th century that we find this stuff in Constantinople, in Ottonian Germany, even in Islamic Spain. If anything, when we talk about infantry warfare at large, the shape would be more or less the same. The reason why it had changed from the migration era with the more habitually circular shield is that weapons are becoming a bit more pernicious. The melee is a bit thicker, and in that sense, prolong a collective business. There is more missile potential. So we want to, even as an infantryman, not just as a horseman who has his thighs very much inside, to have that extension, shield extension, to naturally protect your legs. And in general, yes, your lower parts, I mean, the circular shields had mostly encompassed the entire torso, depending on the size. During the migration era, there was more tendentially individualistic fighting, even though, of course, the prevalent one was always conceived, including, in fact, the essence of these weapons for thickly packed formations. In the previous era, there was literally also just less wealth, to the point that there was less protection at large, even material for shields, but warfare was slightly lighter. If anything, the difference between mounted and foot troops' shields mostly based at least on the divide between knights and commoners that tendentially overlap, even though, again, there are dismounted knights using their same more shields, is the level of convexness, right? The fact that knights are more individually aggressive, they get a bit more audaciously into the melee, and therefore they must have a shield who tendentially protects their sides as well. It's a bit like, I don't know, the Roman scutum versus, I don't know, the Hellenic hoplitic shield. The more aggressive you are in an individual sense, even within a formation, because being individualistically aggressive does not prevent you from being actually a very, otherwise in specific moments, and especially during the maneuvers, etc., like a very disciplined soldier that, however, at a point must attack, right? And this is what medieval armies in the Romano-Germanic world tendentially are. In fact, they are also, in terms of deployment, symmetric. They're devoted to aggression, right? Is having this convex shield so that you can be repaired for more flank side attacks that can come when you are pushing to an enemy formation. Whereas the more humble rank and file soldier, say spearman, that forms the so-called shield wall, that is nor a tactic nor a formation, it's just the obvious interlocking of shields to present a compact, reflecting the thick order of formation that exists just for combat purposes, not for the shields. However, have these shields tendentially flatter, because they're not meant to enter into the melee. They mostly have to maintain cohesion in their ranks, and they can in fact overlap these shields' size with one another without creating discontinuity, which is something you can't really do with more convex shield, or at least you have to do just by pressing them, not overlocking them one another, which also means some, in fact, tendentially greater side space for troops that have to wield heavier weapons like swords, heavier axes, and so on. We're talking just tendencies, right? You could find different things at the same time, the same people fighting in different ways during the same battle. There is nothing fixed. It depends mostly on moral forces, on the unit conditions, on, say, the type of training, of experience, etc. But that shields wide can be that level of divide. There are also, of course, different type of shields. For example, small, even convex ones, right? There are actually lots of pictures that I inserted here from places. This is the tendency in places like Occitania, in Spain, tendentially. That is not to say that what we just said was not true there, but tendentially, as we were remembering before for defining a lionetta, there was a lighter bias towards those areas. There were historically less Frankish, less feudalized, and as a consequence, having a more, in some areas, hit-and-run tactics that required lighter shields. This is true also for places where infantry was pretty heavy and strong and compact. That, however, would also require some light infantry support, right? Aside from missile troops that would use sometimes this. We made videos about this kind of other, probably not even that rare type of skirmishers, but say tendentially less represented by the prevalently feudal sources of the time, that could be equipped with actual melee weapons like early forms of stocks, etc., and that often support, in fact, the heavier troops. For example, if an enemy heavy fighter was stunned by some, I don't know, blow of a club, of axe, whatever, and was just laying down on the field with a broken shoulder or something, the guy who had knocked him down would go on, and his aides or some other, again, people that were around there. This was typical, for example, with knights were unhorsed in the front lines where the spearmen held the formation against cavalry, would in fact exit these ranks and finish off these knights by sticking their daggers into the eye slits. Well, at this point there isn't even much of an eye slit appearing, because helmets are tendentially open, as you know. So you can essentially stick a dagger into somebody's face, eyes, etc., without too much of a problem. So in those gaps between, like in armor, that would be in fact lethal in many ways. And so you have this different types of forms. For example, the more convex round shield was a thing. Sometimes also bigger size, but tendentially smaller one. For this more agile type of warfare, sometimes also for judicial dueling reasons. I made a video about, this is about the 13th century, but the effigy of Malvern Abbey, it's one of the earliest videos I've ever made on Schwerpunkt, would actually illustrate this. You find, in that case, a knight that is fully armored with chainmail from head to toe. However, so having all the classical knightly panoply of the time, except for a bit of primitiveness of the British Isles in that context, but especially this circular shield that normally knights did not have. Mostly it was the kite chivalry, was the tendentially triangular one at that point. It's true that in that sense, maybe the fact that in that century shield was becoming smaller played a role, but so the shape was not even that relevant. However, it's so unusual in iconography and archaeology that for that type of fighter, that the hypothesis that this may have been a professional champion paid for, figuring in duels for juridical settlements, etc., was the case. Tendentially, that was not a convex shield, for example. Tendentially, the convex shield is conceived, as we've seen, to protect more from side blows, but in this smaller form, just also to engage the enemy with more stretched arms, which may be an indicator of need to be ever more distance from your opponent. In the meanwhile, so it's actually a more complex structure to build. It's tendentially more expensive, but it can still apply to these lighter types of troopers, just to mostly as protecting your forearm, your hand, more than else. You can stereotypically think that whoever used this kind of smaller shields was more likely to have that kind of leather kilted armor as sort of the basic one. A minimum form of protection was always there. We often underestimate even hoods of some sort, some caps, to have a minimal head protection. That, of course, is the first thing you're seeking in any kind of combat situation. Although round shields gradually saw a decline in use throughout much of Western Europe in the course of the 12th century, they were actually still there somewhere, especially in Spain, as we said before, because this lighter type of warfare kind of fit the general context. That is true also for later times, like the 13th century, right? I also made a video about the 12th, 13th century Spanish knight, which actually doesn't document more than much, but if you go, for example, look at the thumbnail of one of my videos about the Reconquista, you find a very famous Spanish manuscript illumination that shows like this heavily armored knights fighting, however, with javelins and round shields. Next to consider that javelins were actually still there, especially in the first half of the 12th century for heavy cavalry as well. Think about, I don't know, the previous century, William the Conqueror's Hastings Norman knights, right? And they, before charging, they tended to soften up the enemy lines with javelins, which in many ways were also similar to the spears that they conventionally used. And they were actually pretty effective also anti-armor weapons, right? Never underestimate the javelin in that function. Would remain, especially in siege warfare, such an excellent anti-armor weapon. However, at that point, the cavalryman was tendentially specializing in shock charges, and even having javelins as a side weapon was not that useful anymore. You would prefer to have like a sword, as a second sword as a side weapon, even a crossbow or something more punching. Look, we've seen it, for example, in the video about Ottokar, king of Bohemia, Ottokar II. That at that point we're talking in the second half of the 13th century. That's a heavily westernized, in that case Germanized context, where you have 1.5 hand sword, like it's a side weapon next to the also the one like tied to the saddle, and of course even in that case the primary weapon is the spear for smashing into the enemy. We were just the other day talking about tournaments and how, of course, squires provided multiple their masters with multiple spears after these went broken one by one during combat. So again, combined arms, especially when it comes to cavalry charges, it's fundamental. But these do include infantry. A vexata question about the actual use of infantry at this point is how conventionalized its combination with cavalry was. I mean, in terms of formation of tactics, like some think that the infantry on the wings was already not as a division, but properly as the wings of a single battle line. If not the prevalent use, but at least was still there. We've found other cases in which instead, no, it's more like a divisional unit on its own. We will see it in different battles, but consider that it's only from the 13th century that we get a more precise understanding of how armies were actually deployed on the battlefield in a very sort of detailed, concrete way. Like interpreting a 12th century battle is very complicated most of the times, and the impression is that even though there may be some sort of explicit fundamentals, and historians, especially the clergy that was well versed in at this, especially starting from this point in the 12th century Renaissance, in that kind of classical studies of the Roman antiquities, of all those battles, battle accounts and so on, they would try to rationalize, to sort of categorize a certain picture. Do not really, that's the impression, that they do not really tell the whole truth, nor they necessarily were supposed to, right? I'm actually very very supportive of narrative sources. They are really the only way you can reconstruct battles at any point in history, really the only ones. There's literally no other type of source. But of course the importance, the effectiveness, the possibility from these sources of providing with that kind of clear picture of the battlefield, unfortunately, is not there. There are lots of different examples of things that were happening, right? Saying this guy was doing that, there's these encounters like on the battlefield, but the whole picture, all these events tied together, are not quite there yet, fully delineated. And actually, not even later on, we know everything that happened in medieval battles, but at least we can sort of reconstruct it in a comprehensive way, or one that at least sort of can be compared with other battles to say, okay, well, likely things were that way, because in the 13th century there is not just the peak of medieval civilization, but in that sense the one of military uniformation. In the 12th century, differences between other countries were tendentially more pronounced, and given that armies were smaller, that's also another important aspect of it. Engagements less relevant. At that point, you could find different combinations, because that's what normally happens. The smaller the engagement, the more sort of disordered, or at least also inventive, ingenious it can be, right? Compared to the only way, like when you have so many forces and the means just to field them on a regular basis, like in the 13th century, then actually all Western Europeans fight in one essentially homogeneous way, right? As we said before, there were these scorchers, think about the Brabançon, etc., and any other kind of auxiliary force there to support cavalry in different ways, and or looting, raiding, and having short swords, potentially a cutel or cultellus, which is sort of dagger/knife. There are many types of these. At some point we will cover them in a more precise apological sense. However, again, the essence of the troops using them, aside from these weapons, the fact that these weapons could be found on the side of much better equipped warriors, is this apparently strange role of, say, cavalry fights, and you have this scattered rabble that helps by, I don't know, kneeling under the enemy mounts and disemboweling the horses, or stabbing the knights. So as you understand, it's nothing fully or even remotely functionalized in a tactical or formation sense, right? It's just like something you can see in any disorderly fight, while what matters, of course, is the combat dynamic between the more compact units. These are not exceptions, we find them. They're not really light infantry. However, they do fight in scattered order, and they mostly intervene. And the advantage of this is that they could intervene as little task forces to, I don't know, penetrate certain gaps that had formed in the units, because from horseback, like in the fight between knights, it was difficult just to maintain, especially after the charge, if, as it normally didn't happen, like the clash prolonged itself after the charge instead of pulling back and trying to reform for another charge. It was easier for the foot to exploit any gaps and surrounding knights that had stopped, right, and dragging them down, right? This is something you find in different instances. It's not just about having those blunt, let's say, this bludgeoning weapons, like that. Those were important, especially in the ranks immediately behind the pikemen, that were always the guys that stopped, the only guys that could stop cavalry, if not other cavalry, in the front ranks of the infantry, that, if anything, had to smash down, like in a very heavy sense, any knight would break through. These guys instead are something else. They're scorchers. People were just habituated to rape, loot, and not being that higher kind of professional fighting, but that always joined for the hype, for the loot, and so on. Scabbards, of course, are talking about how these weapons were encased at times. They would maybe just iconographically we find them sometimes protruding from the slits even in armor, right, for heavier fighters. Also because they had to be at some point unseated in that case, and you needed this access while still maintaining important protection at large. This tells you how important the side weapon is. I mean, if you are rich enough to go to war with metal armor, and you have slits that on the sides that of course are designed mostly to provide you with more mobility, more agility for the legs, etc., but also you can exploit for technically exposing your hip to some degree, but to also grab a side weapon from that. You understand how important that side weapon technically was, especially, as we were just saying, if you are a heavily armored warrior, and as such, you are fighting, you're tendentially fighting, you should be fighting, also as a general expectation from your comrades, etc., against equals, right, or even people who are stronger than you, and therefore breaking armor, as we understand now, is quite difficult. You can use these stalks, these short swords, to again exploit the gaps within armor itself. So maybe exactly stabbing at those same armor side slits, for example, but not only. Like, you are well armored enough just to approach the enemy at that short of a distance. Of course, there were pretty heavily armored troops at this point. The battle of this period we already covered is the one of Bourg-de-Rude, which witnessed particular context, in fact, essentially Norman, an Anglo-Norman, but also Western Frankish context of dismounted knights, which was a way to go on a regular basis. We are in 1124, so it's a relatively early time. Remember what I said at the beginning, also the third, fourth of the 12th century is the moment at which really knights take this leap forward. They really affirm themselves as the hegemonic force on the battlefield from their mounts, right, from their war horses. Before, the chance of seeing, especially in countries like England, in this case Normandy, Germany, dismounted knights is quite frequent. Even some imperial, royal armies do dismount at times. In part, it's also due to the fact that some of these countries are wilder, environmentally speaking. Germany is still covered at this point, and until in fact the reign of Frederick Barbarossa then imports, say, fully fledged Western Frankish feudalism in Germany by forests, swamps, and this goes in. I mean, it's not that Barbarossa single-handedly changed that, but tendentially also the military system mirrors that clearance, that deforestation, that reclamation of the territory, the Aussiedlung, and so on. This was not anew. Think about the Swabian mercenaries with the massive swords facing the Normans on foot at Civitate, actually being wiped out by the same Normandy cavalry charges, and we're talking about that superiority of cavalry charges a century before that. You can check that video about Bourg-de-Rude out, because it's quite exemplificative of the fact that, of course, you could find in combat in front of you, even as while not fighting against cavalry, essentially dismounted cavalrymen that were pretty extensively armored. The average one would have had helmet, mail, hauberk, and so padded coat underneath. There were heavier types of armor. Today we'll not talk about this, but multiple layers of chainmail did exist. I made multiple videos about chainmail as well. There were at most even 3 layers, but this was just the ultra hyper heavy elite cavalry that could even barely move, and at least also many powerful countries in the West did not really have the reason to field in a broader, systematic way. Like in the 12th century witnesses still, I don't know, the Nicephorian cataphracts in the Byzantine Empire, but that's just because that was a huge empire that also by this point does not have too many clear evidence of extensive use of these ultra-heavy horsemen conceived literally to smash everything that existed in front of them, except they were just as the last resort, as the last resort, because otherwise they would have been overwhelmed. They would have overly exhausted themselves. They would charge literally at pace, right? We don't see this stuff in the West. In the West, there is a much more fluid, dynamic situation, also with pretty heavy cavalry. The Byzantines themselves noted, as we've seen also in battles like the one of Dyrrhachion, that of course the Westerners were the best cavalrymen, right? That when they charged, they were magnificent. They were unruly, they were undisciplined in their perspective, but in part that was still being done by such tank individually. It can be unruly, but it's not unruly like an average final rank soldier. It's unruly like something that smashes into you at high speed and overwhelming everything in a de facto suicidal way, which was paradoxically the best way also to survive the clash. As we were saying before, a more heavily armored man was tendentially one that was meant to fight against his own counterpart. This is what even just not just political or socially, but in a technical sense, the battlefield produced. You normally send the heavies against the heavies, cavalry against cavalry, and so the way these guys are equipped are essentially to destroy their alter ego. Some of them were armed. We have very beautiful depiction of this in the aforementioned Carmen, the Rebus Siculus by Peter of Eboli. We have here I used an ivory carving representing like at least the guys who killed Thomas Becket. This is from the second half of 12th century. In fact, very Britain, even though, as you know, the Thomas Becket martyrdom iconography is pretty widespread immediately all over Western Europe in many different depictions. In any case, these long-handled, broad-bladed axes, right? These are, as you will see now, the direct descendants of the so-called Danish axes. They actually were descending from Carolingian axes. We'll explain it now, but I already did also in other videos. This weapon naturally is there also as a continuity of that tendentially foot kind of combat that, albeit not prevalent, is still here and there present, especially in Anglo-Norman England and these other northern European countries that had an important Norse influence. The Berno-Norse, think about how, I don't know, the Gallo-like thing, that this Gallo-Norse lords that were surviving at the outskirts of the civilized world, even well into the Renaissance with that same kind of equipment. The simple purpose in that case is chopping a human being to pieces, right? There is literally no other way of putting that. It takes a lot of physique to train with just even with a sword, right? Imagine with a double-handed axe. They weren't excessively heavy, but they still exhaust you. Plus you're with armor on, so this is tendentially sort of heavier infantry. We've seen how, for example, the Varangians at the aforementioned Battle of Dyrrhachium fought. There were many Englishmen among them because many of these guys were refugees from the Norman invasion that had gone over to Constantinople in order to fight the Siculo-Normans in southern Italy, and so having this kind of revenge. In fact, Dyrrhachium is a sort of a pay-road Hastings. We even find in today's Albania some reliefs from that same era that mirror some Draco, just like the one you find given to the Anglo-Danish depicted on the Bayeux tapestry. You see how small the world technically is, but it's not like these double-handed axes were just stemming from a Norse background. Even though the countries where you would find these axes more used, at least in the West, or at least the extended West, were England and Scandinavia, these weapons had not actually as historically originated from there. As we were explaining before, the guys who wielded these weapons historically were the most armored ones around, which back in the day were the Carolingians, that had the most feudally elite professional mounted force out there, that however is being tendentially ever more equestrian in nature, could simply not use a double-handed axe on horseback, at least in any systematically functional way. Instead, Northern Europe, having had a lesser development of cavalry, especially in that, say, surgically shocked and professionally dimension, because they didn't have really have a feudal system like the Franks, tended also to dismount. This is famous for the Anglo-Saxons, for the Vikings to a degree. It's not like they didn't use cavalry extensively. This is especially the case of the Vikings. We have pretty large evidence of that. We will surely make at some point a military historical unit. Will be the best video ever about the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-Danish cavalryman. That was militarily also a thing. Ask the same Harold Godwinson. Especially when not just he fought in Normandy, but also against the Welsh, for example. That's another story. And so the reason for the greater presence of eventually what would be called for this reason the Danish axe, because it was associated with the most powerful Viking nation out there, is this simply greater proportion and importance of infantry. You would find this in Ruthenia as well. We're talking major double-handed axes. Like axes just like that were also present more or less in this broader outskirts of civilization. There were lots of them among the Slavic countries, among the Baltics. We have seen this recently in recent videos. They had different purpose. They had also some kind of anti-armor functionality, but with a smaller axe, like you have to come close to that knight, and as we've seen, it's a bit more difficult to do in open field. Reason for which ambushes, in those tougher grounds of the, for example, of the Baltic Crusades, are a bit the favored context, like assault troops of some kind at close range, in conditions in which cavalry cannot fully deploy. In fact, the reason why you find instead the double-handed axe in this sort of more open grounds in northwestern Europe is not much the fact that this weapon had any particular anti-cavalry capacity, if not when cavalry had stopped, like after the charge. In fact, we explained the relation mostly. The front ranks were made of pikemen. In fact, the same dismounted knights would use their spears in anti-cavalry function, not really axes. You see on the Bayeux Tapestry, yes, an Anglo-Danish guy smashing the skull of a Norman horseman. However, that is not the preferential reality, also because that horse is just going to, if it's launched at full speed, is going to smash you anyway. That only the pike stops a cavalry charge, and it's not even a guarantee that will happen. Cavalrymen charging to pikes all the time, also because again those were the only weapons actually that you could actually oppose to a cavalry charge. It's all about the cohesion of the unit, of the formation. Also later, infantry victories, say in the first half of the 14th century, were not due to the fact that there were newer weapons, like they were more functionalized over time, but they weren't even just mostly the product of professional forces that would think in terms of, now I will functionalize my club just for being effective against horsemen. There was surely some kind of knightly advice there. As look at Courtrai, for example, from the same Counts of Flanders, Dampierre, but we're far away. The reason, again, why these so-called Danish axes, there are actually Frankish axes, are to be found in this context is that opponents would fight on foot. very often, also of this kind of heavily armored type. There were different names in the vocabulary of the time for calling this Danish axis that in fact reflected that only apparent Scandinavian origin, at least in ancestrally speaking. This was more modern, but there is no doubt, of course, that these weapons were there. Also in later medieval Scandinavia, there were similar weapons that remained a bit more because of the tougher grounds of forests, etc. So for the men-at-arms were useful. Ash de Danemark, Ashet Danesh, or Ash Danesh, translating to Danish axis, right? So it's like, I don't know, the French call the 1.5 hands, the swords, the Grande Épée d'Allemagne, for example, the big swords of Germany. The reason being, by the way, not much that, as it was said, it was just by a few inches Germans were bigger than other Europeans, than southwestern Europeans. It was the fact that they fought more dismounted than them on a regular basis, so that was a more preferable weapon to handle on foot. Like a 1.5 sword can be effectively wielded from horseback, a double-handed one not. And also the reason why the Northmen, the Scandinavians, say had these double-handed axes and not swords, say, is in part parallel by that. The Germans were more tendentially chivalric. So, yes, they would dismount, but they would use mostly a spear on horseback more often than not, and then if dismounted or also mounted this 1.5-handed sword for every eventuality. Also in context that were more individualistic, but the Norse would have the need to fight more frequently on foot and also smash, in fact, the heavily armored opponents with this sort of even more enhanced, specialized weapon for that specific purpose. Which is the same reason why you find this weapon among the Anglo-Danish before, and you still, in fact, witness it in Anglo-Norman England, a bit for the same continuation of that tradition. Because especially the Midlands, Northern England, were poor, less socially stratified, and so it was sort of more frequent. We see, I talked about this in the video about medieval English and Welsh warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, more archaisms. You don't just see this double-handed axis, but for example, poorer equipment, less armor, right? This is, if you trace the direction vectorially, you're right to the aforementioned Iberno Norse double-handed swordsmen at the end of the Middle Ages that literally still fight like half of a millennium before, because nothing had changed there. Time passed more slowly in the far north. By the way, King Stephen used a double-handed axe at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. The same Richard the Lionheart was seen with such a weapon during the rescue of Jaffa in 1192. These weapons have nothing deterministic attached to them. What we should stress, as we've seen in many videos about knighthood, is that knights were conceived for being trained first and foremost with any kind of weapon existing. Meaning knights were better than, for example, regular archers at archery. Also because they hunted from horseback, for example. Now we'll talk partially about that to mounted archery. But of course they would normally conventionally functionalize for that shock charge, and so also their equipment was tendentially not a longbow, let's say. But during sieges, for example, you do find that. I mean, the same Lionheart died the way you know, like he was literally dueling with a crossbow with a guy on a tower on the ramparts, and like it ended badly for him. But if you really needed to split open a human rib cage, hopefully like even just breaking armor, which was the ultimate point of these weapons, swords included, right? If you look at the way they were created historically, until plate armor kicked in, swords were created essentially for the purpose of cutting, and we know that these weapons were tendentially perfected against armor. So the actual tendency, also considering the varying quality of armor that replicas often do not take into account, would entail that you could cut through weapon. It was difficult, you would destroy the same weapon to a degree, and in fact that's what more or less the balance gets down to. You destroy a sword, you destroy an armor. And of course with a double-handed axe you can't literally smash somebody, and even if you don't break the armor you can't cause massive internal trauma to bleed the person from the within. If you have to sweep, I don't know, enemy ramparts during a siege, you can swing your double-handed axe, cutting people to pieces without much of a problem, especially if these are tendentially lighter troops, as we've seen. So with a better armor, you can get into this gory business quite quickly and quite easily. Troops like these were, of course, picked elite that was meant to open horrendous gaps in the ranks of lighter troops. That, on average, lighter meant still among the heavy infantry, lighter than in relation to those guys, looked like spearmen with a knife or sword as a side weapon, protected solely by a shield and helmet. Maybe some padded clothing, as we've seen, but sometimes not even that, especially in the poorer areas. This is what you would see essentially between the late 11th and the 12th centuries. In terms of cost-benefits ratio, these are good troops. Again, they can operate as heavy infantry, so with adequate training you can have fairly lot of them, and opposing them, in fact, also to more cuirass troops that may, of course, get the upper hand on them in combat, but for example they will spend themselves in order to destroy them, and so you will, for example, maybe tire them, soften them up. So these are excellent troops, for example, for defending a position, a bridge, a fortress. You need them also to surround the fortress during sieges. They are the typical final rank trooper that you don't often hear of, and that we have discussed, if anything, in the aforementioned battles, a bit as the unsung, maybe not heroes, but still like effective troops, making the bulk, at least the numerical bulk of these armies. They were not the decisive bulk. Were they left on their own, say, against all the heavy component, the latter would have likely prevailed, attritionally mostly, and exhausting itself, but still. You understand how the combination of these forces with, in fact, the heavier forces with the lighter ones, including, as we'll see now, missile element, would enhance, would multiply the force of an army. When we look at the missile, we realize that they didn't have much armor to begin with. Actually, they normally had nothing at all, maybe a helmet, right? The most important thing for these troops is just to shoot from a distance. They're not even supposed to engage with anybody else except individuals like them, right? So with the same level of armoredness and the same level of equipment. It's like the aforementioned guys. They do not really need much armor because they're not even meant to be in melee for such a prolonged time. And in any case, their front ranks are more heavily armored. That's also how it works. It's not like there were essentially separated units of heavily armored elements, unless we're talking about specific sections, subsections of the line, etc. Normally, you would have, I don't know, an 8 ranked deep formation. It was really typical since Xenophon, and the better troops were in the front because the file openers were also the guys that were more expert, knew how to remain in formation, and so that you would just follow from the posterior ranks without losing the overall cohesion. So once those first ranks were knocked out, normally the posterior ones gave way, and or at least were in a pretty bad condition. They were also unarmed, say field aides, servants, etc., that could psychologically add to the number, like making noise, showing themselves behind, like to show as if like the unit was bigger, even though they were not even meant to fight. In part, this could be said for the missile, that must just shoot at a distance, and at most is going to be either shot down by an equivalent of this or cut down during the rout by some horseman, also a light horseman, against whom they don't have too much chance, except they could be themselves dismounted horse archers. We will see it now, because this is not so. I made a video about, I think, 13th century mounted crossbowmen. That is, as we were saying before, even though in a relatively smaller proportion out there as some sort of elite unit, or at least one that would be tendentially cared as a professional one of the few units that was de facto permanently maintained by communes, by other, also like royal household, princely households, and so on. I will not digress here on the advantages of the crossbow, because in general we all understand what it is. Like, there were just more powerful devices. There were all kinds of crossbows. There were bows that were more powerful than crossbows. But tendentially the crossbow will take over this entire space. Even England was, as we were saying before, with the anecdote of Richard I taking this crossbows from the Crusades. That's not how it really happened to England. It actually did have that as perhaps not the prevalent weapon, but definitely not in their armies, but not that differently from France, say. The social and anthropological reasons for which levies tendentially knew how to use bows as hunters is pretty obvious. We know that some of the best archers, say in England, came from the communities of woodsmen, from the royal forests, that sometimes were, as you know, not even technically literal forests, sometimes they were moors or something, but those were people who hunted for a living and therefore knew how to use bows well. They would recruit just the biggest, the fittest men, that thus were also tendentially taller, more muscular, and therefore used bigger bows, longer bows, hence the longbow. I made multiple videos also recently about medieval English infantry, say of the 13th century, so the period in which the extensive use of the longbow in a specialized fashion in the English army was practically made in a de facto doctrinal way, right? Of all the infantry victors of the early 14th century, the English are the only ones that not just tendentially fight on foot because they are mostly pressured by the circumstances, they switched from a more conventionally mounted context to a dismounted one, as we've seen in the video about Poitiers, but that have essentially wanted to enhance this missile element among infantry, because the concept was the more trained troops we have with the longbow, given that many subjects just use it, and it's essentially a power shooter of some sort, at least for a missile element. You still needed lots of them to have a tangible effect, but the more we can, let's say, in fact, also save probably some money from it. In fact, the point why the English used such longbowmen is not entirely clear, except it's much more straightforward in nature. They began to recruit just what they had, right? If, as we said before, the poorer Midlanders that still fought with this archaic weaponry, like could provide more missile troops than heavy infantry because they were literally poor. That's what the English found themselves to field, especially during the wars of Scottish independence, close to, in fact, to that northern border where tendentially more recruits would be taken from. The myth that the Welsh had better archers is completely debunked from a long time. Actually, the English archers were paid more than the Welsh ones. The Welsh were very good, say again, against the Irish at times, brought by the English there. But the reason why they were so prominent, and also because the Irish were very unarmed, but the reason why they were so prominent later is not because they were better or worse archers than the English, it's that they were poorer than the English, and so they were more likely to enlist to make a living in the military, which otherwise sucked, like a more gentrified farmer would not really want to do. Even though, as we were saying before, English kings began to incentivize it, as you know, in festivals, in this other sort of collective occasions, training competition with the bow, to also recruit more skilled archers. The point is that the archers did not substitute for heavy troops. So the case of England is relatively eccentric, but you shouldn't think that the English technically wanted to go at war with more, at least with less heavy infantry than any other Western European force. If that happened, it's also because they found a bit themselves in that circumstance, and they habituated themselves to fight with slightly different organic ratios than other arms ratios than other peoples, but at large their armies were identical, conceptually, intentionally, and doctrinally, even though this is a bit of a anachronistic term, to the ones of France. Right, the English men-at-arms that were not ideally conceived to fight dismounted. They could, as we've seen, fight in every kind of situation, because a knight fights in every kind of situation with every kind of weapon. Not longbow in that case, but even though they knew how to use it. But they would have preferably, in fact, fought mounted, hadn't they had against the French many times such a numerical disadvantage that it was better to think of defense. And that is better on foot than offensive. That's how the English tactics of the 100 Years' War actually happened. Right, the same notion that the crossbow was worse than the longbow is completely BS. At least there is no evidence whatsoever that this was the case. Not even during the great English victories of the 100 Years' War. I mean, accuracy, if you account that the Genoese were less, that they fought on a worse ground, that there are all those excuses, the fact that they had humid bowstrings, which is false, by the way, because they perfectly knew how to keep them dry like any archer. Regardless of whether the French were more or less habituated to use these professionals of missile warfare, that makes no comparison. Just the fact that they were not equal in number presents a problem. Like, the outcome is not... How is that due to any qualitative superiority if those were even less? The Genoese were even less. The Genoese were kept being used regularly, even after these French debacle, and basically all of Europe kept using the crossbow. Actually, longbows were largely produced in Lombardy and exported to England, which is interesting because the Lombards kept using crossbows at large, and there was no reason to switch to the longbow unless, again, we dig into those also relatively imprecise theories we can't substantiate and decide to distract ourselves from the fact that English armies were essentially identical to the French ones when we look at material culture, at the essentials, at the core fundamentals of what these armies also organizationally, militarily were. Crossbows were tendentially, if we're going back to the 12th century, were tendentially a bit better armored at times than archers because of their background. Again, the crossbows were more cultivated by states in small numbers that were given a better equipment, and they had higher training to cost more, so that you wanted to protect them as an investment. Archers instead could be found so easily, and so you didn't even need to armor them very much, and they were basically the worst. The crossbow actually was superior to the bow, also to the longbow actually. Greater penetration, actually greater range. in terms of practical expendability, even if a longbow can't reach very good, ranges and has high performance, the crossbow does that much more easily. And so when you reason militarily, you know that it's the good enough, not the sophisticated finesse of the extreme theory that you should be searching for. So that's also the point. There is not really a weapon that radically outclasses another in medieval technology. Having an arm, even numbers even are not that important, but it depends on their training, their experience, their morale, how you interact, say how you manage combined arm tactics, and the brunt of it all is borne by the heavies, by the men at arms, right? In all the English victories of the 100 Years' War, first of all, we never find any evidence, any source saying, they won because they had better archers. No, right? First of all, nobody cared. Nobody had that mentality at the time to even write in a chronicle. And secondly, it's evident that, of course, the main deal was, as usual, the battle line, so the heavy elements and how they crashed against one another. Combined arms were good. You needed, in the sense, these missile troops. Everybody used them, in fact, but they were not, even had they been the tip of the balance, this happened on the basis of an iceberg that was much bigger, was represented by the heavies. And so it doesn't make any sense to pretend that they were the game changer there, especially compared to moral forces that are also much less calculable. We have seen it in many videos. Actually, the hints, the observation is that missile troops were incredibly limited in effectiveness compared especially to what this over-exaltation, especially of the longbow, was made for, essentially historiographical national reasons. Now, in the 12th century, archers would commonly carry their arrows in a quiver at the right hip, either attached to the waist belt or slung across the left shoulder. For example, by the 13th century, the standard method for carrying longbow arrows evolved to having them point down through the belt to knock them faster, which probably suggests like how sort of more regimented and accelerated that kind of higher rate of fire was required, as you understand here, not because of the type of weapon, but because of the type of tactics, right, that required that. So that corresponds also in part to likely some, again, more enhanced specialization or tendential professionalization. In fact, in the 14th century, with the indenture, you realize that those troops were becoming professionals, and it's a broader change. This happens actually with all troops throughout the 13th century, especially in the second half. I made lots of videos about 13th century wages and more. Occasionally, archers were mounted to keep up with cavalry. We've seen this in the aforementioned battle at Bourg Therould in 1124. Mounted archers feature in several records concerning the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland. For Bourg Therould, we are not given any specific reason why there would be such mounted archers. It's not that often that you see that in combat, right? We do know from different documents that, again, different cities armed their exercitus with specific professional, in fact, missile companies that were containing numbers, etc. But in battle accounts, you don't see them. And you know they were there, evidently, but the accounts do not really recount them, as they actually recount infantry, as we've seen, not as often as heavy cavalry, but still. So Bourg Therould, one of the reasons why you find horse archery may be that since the defenders were fighting dismounted, they had these lighter elements harassing the enemy, as it says in the account, harassing the enemy heavy cavalry, targeting their horses, which is something that the Westerners were habituated to. For example, in the Crusades battles against the massive hails of arrows of the Seljuk armies, for example. If you make some estimate, you realize Mostly we have that number for the Mongol era because it's better documented, but the armies were essentially the same in terms of logistical capacity. Like an army of 30,000 men, most of which were horse archers, would be able to unleash something of like hundreds of thousands, even a million or more arrows, ideally in a single engagement. Most of these arrows were actually not that impressive at all, which is one of the reasons why, in fact, the West was superior also as far as the use of crossbow was concerned. The Mongols will end up using Frankish cavalry and Italian marines. And the Ilkhanate of Persia, that specifically in the 13th century, so in the same year, same century in which the Mongols had devastated Central European armies, Central Eastern European armies during the first invasion. So you realize it's mostly made. Lots of it is about Mongol warfare. There is a lot to say there regarding moral forces. The Mongols were actually much more primitive than we often think, even in just their habitual warfare. Yes, they had Chinese engineers, artillerists, etc. But if you look at the essence of their armies, they were just that crude and brutal, primitive steppe archers and cavalrymen. Like their lifestyle, their entire military system was based on that specific social background. We can't eliminate it from the equation. We have seen in some battles how the Westerners did, at least anecdotally, because I don't think we ever seen a battle in which that XII is a bit like that. The Westerners would protect their horses against the Turkic, the Uyghur horse archery on that occasion by having them deployed at the center of the column, screened at the front, at the sides, at the rear by infantrymen, shielded infantrymen that would thus help protecting the vulnerable horses that at large were not armored. So these mounted horse archers are not frequently to be found in the West, but the Westerners knew what they were about. In the video about the Turcopoles, we explained how ethnic Western Europeans had perfectly learned how to shoot from horseback like the Turks. The Turcopoloi were not just local Levantines that knew the craft. People learned that. In fact, by the end of the period, it's mostly like a type of trooper rather than any ethnic connotation. Turcopolus in Greek means the child of the Turk, because initially these were people who had essentially learned the craft from their Turkic background, but since the Crusaders had conquered the Near East, they found themselves under their control, and they were recognized as Turks that were foreigners to the Near East as well, because they came mostly from the Middle East, at least in their major ethnic settlement outside of Central Asia, in the quadrant, let's say, of Western Eurasia. To make the long story short, yes, mounted archery did exist in the West. We have documented it on many occasions. Also in the English armies of the 100 Years' War later on, I made a video about, for example, the chevauchée armies organization, the size, the composition. It's often not clear what these troops really fought like, or were expected to fight like. Just like the men-at-arms could and would dismount to fight on some frequent basis, the lighter element could actually, as also explorers, as skirmishers, as runners of some kind, could and would be mounted. So that, say, the average longbowman that mostly fought as an infantryman of an indenture could be provided with horses at times, and actually a great part of the chevauchée armies was mounted. So just by statistically, there were normally lots of archers compared to the men-at-arms, and so we realized that at least a part of the English army contemplated mounted archery on a regular basis. Of course, there were heavy infantrymen as well. There were not men at arms. Now it's complicated. Also, the 100 Years' War lasts more than a century. It's not even like this way of war was peculiar to the 100 Years' War for the English, for others. So we see lots of interesting things. There was likely much more horse archery than we think in the West during the 12th century. Always remember, every nobleman knew how to shoot a bow from horseback, just for the sake of hunting. The side weapon could contemplate a bow, a crossbow even. The myth that the papacy was trying to ban the crossbow is a complete misunderstanding of the episode, and it especially has nothing to do with the legitimate nobility of Europe. If anything, that mirrored the spread of the bow of the crossbow among this 12th century infantrymen, the Brabançons, that eventually were also heretics, écorcheurs, as they were known in French. And so they were dangerous for cavalry, because cavalry, again, as we've seen, it was tendentially vulnerable to missile projectiles. Even though, again, that was not really the game changer. You couldn't really stop a cavalry charge with missile weapons, right? You could partially bog it down, could take down some horses. We know that regularly from battle accounts, if anybody has ever handled sources of medieval battles, that at the end of these clashes, horses were, especially during the 13th to 14th century, horses took a lot of hits, a lot of losses, not knights. That is kind of obvious. That can, of course, mirror the disruption of the same cavalry charge to a degree, but this occurred over time during combat, and it was true for both sides, because it's not like one side used missile weapons and the other didn't. Like, it was all very symmetrical, very specular, so to say. So there were lots of misconceptions connected to this, and of course the wide majority of losses in general in this warfare, also among horses, was produced in hand-to-hand fighting, and or especially like the chase after the enemy had been broken. For the Anglo-Norman horse archery during the invasion of Ireland, you can understand a bit better the reason. Before, we remembered Harold Godwinson using cavalry against the Welsh on the western frontier. This was tendentially lighter cavalry than one that the Anglo-Saxons would use also by themselves, surely lighter than was used in Normandy. There were different fighting styles. The Bretons were historically recorded for being more skirmish-oriented, and in any case, they were also heavy at that point as within the Western Frankish kingdom. However, in the Celtic fringe, you would need to adapt more to guerrilla tactics, guerrilla warfare. As you were saying before, the Anglo-Normans brought Welsh archers in Ireland, and given the poor armoredness of the Irish, apparently a massacre ensued. At least lots of people were killed by those Welsh archers in the enemy ranks. But when you're especially countering guerrilla, you have to hit and run, you have to move fast, etc. Like, horse archery is good, especially against light opponents. The Irish had a few cavalry, and mostly they scattered in the forest. There was no way to essentially chase them, but using this more unconventional tactics. Otherwise, the Anglo-Normans were habituated to fight against the Western Franks, so they were part of the Western Franks and Western Frankish themselves. So that, at large, tells you that they would fight with heavier forces. The Battle of Book does witness horse archers, but you can't, from the essentially the Anglo-Norman side against the local Norman rebels, but doesn't mean that the the Anglo-Normans per se had necessarily more horse archers than the rest of the West. I imagine I don't know, even the Aquitanians, the Spanish having surely something in that direction. We have, again, we're talking also horse archers, like mounted crossbowmen. We do find them pretty much everywhere, in France, in Italy especially. They're part of that sort of more professional tactical component that is also, however, numerically not irrelevant, but just minority for heavily bulky, heavy cavalry and heavy infantry based armies, right? So that's where you can contextualize also the horse archers wherever you found them, in a context like this, in which maybe ideally half of throughout all the 12th century, a very ideal average, like half of the missile was bowmen and archers and the others were crossbowmen. You would find this also for among the mounted element. But we tend to underestimate how frequent horse archery was in Western warfare since ever. And how it's not much that it had to be frequent in a statistical sense, but how easy it is to have this kind of troops, right? Fighting with lots of them, it's just something that the steppes people do, right? For reasons that are not flattering at large. In fact, they are the outskirts of civilization. They do not actually conquer the latter. And the better way for fighting is the latter, the sedentary one, that in fact does not care too much for light elements when they have the heavy ones that can even withstand a lot of horse archers, a lot of archery fire. Look at the Franks at the Battle of Dorylaeum, for that matter, and these guys that looked like, I don't know, the porcupines with all those arrows stuck in their armor that would have not killed them, like also because of the padded armor and so on. Of course, these weapons did penetrate, even that if you could get pretty nasty wounds, even mortal ones, especially also due to infection later on. But at large, the heavy troops, the ones that, as we've seen, constituted also the shock element of the army, the decisive element of the army, were the better protected. And even if the horses tendentially weren't, or at least they had lighter protection, they were practically immune to those arrows. It's what we were saying before about weapons in general. Armor, heavily armored guys, are essentially protected from most weapons in terms of hand-to-hand combat at close range. Then, of course, like weapons launched at the sum of 45 kilometers per hour, there is the canter pace. Cavalry smashes at is another story. That's suicidal. But in terms of missile protection at large, it's better to get an arrow at a distance than, say, a javelin at close range. In fact, as we were saying before, it was the knights that would mostly use, that could come also closer to the enemy, differently from the archers who were, yes, more agile, lighter, but also less protected, and very often not mounted, couldn't come close to other troops. And it was those heavies that, at large, were called to throw this pretty heavy stuff against each other with minimal projection capacity at long range. And in fact, archery in that sense was not really too dangerous. It was dangerous considering all the projectiles that constantly flew during these battles. It could be very nasty, especially we're reminded that at that point the majority of helmets at this point was not closed. You could have some aventail, some camels and stuff, but at large it was easy to be targeted in the face. But even that was so more important for the sake of order, for receiving orders, looking around, being aware of the situation, was actually preferred in a conventional fashion to enclosed helmets that mostly, as apparently developed, mostly in order to protect from cavalry lances in your face rather than crossbows. Like there is this cliche that is repeated basically in every in any article, in any publication about medieval warfare of the era, as if armor developed exclusively because of the crossbow technology. This is one of the most stupid technologistic answers that are so shamefully repeated without any military logic. Like, what do you think it's more likely to be killed, like, as a knight, like on a regular basis, by crossbow bolts, or by a cavalry lance arriving literally 90 kilometers per hour against you at that point, in your face, with an enormous mass pushing it for literally passive from side to side, right? It's not like crossbows were not highly performing sometimes, but at best a close range, and of course receiving swords hits and lance hits at close range was a much greater factor for the further development of armor. That was also due to the relative affluence, the absolute affluence of the type of trooper. Like, knights were becoming ever richer in relative terms, as well as the system was becoming ever richer in relative terms, so you could have better equipment compared to the migration era to begin with. So the notion that missile weapons would have dictated the development of arms and armor is absolutely absurd. All right, it would have accounted for a minor part of it. It's not to say that it wasn't important, nor that the crossbow wasn't important, but it didn't have that knight killing capacity. Otherwise, everybody would have used crossbows, and there would have not been horsemen whatsoever. It's such a ridiculous idea. Overall, in fact, it was going back to the aforementioned topic, in Western Europe, archers did not typically shoot from horseback. The practice of horse archery during the 12th and 13th century was primarily prevalent, as we've seen in Central Asia, parts of Eastern Europe as well, the Middle East, the broader East, up to very far away. And we have made multiple videos about different Eastern military cultures, units, armies organization, to explain why that was the case, why that combination. That is ultimately not just a military thing, but also a political and social one. Right? So you have all kinds of aspects of criticism, like different things you want to look at. Today, again, we were talking about heavy 12th century infantry, heavy and light alike, for the sake of introducing what 12th century infantry generally was at large. Actually, I promised you I would digress briefly on the meaning of the art of war in infantry at the time. In part, we have already done it. I would like just to point out the greatest development of infantry at this point, that is to be found in Lombardy. Especially during the wars against Frederick Barbarossa, there are some major battles, including Carcano and Legnano, that are, as you know, like such, they're so important. There are also other encounters. In Carcano, you have, just for telling you what this infantry was made of, again, we don't talk about this today just per se, it's mostly a matter of, today we're talking about arms and armor, right? But for telling you the level of training of these troops, like, we made lots of videos about Italian warfare during this period, not too much, but we have made one recently, a couple of months ago, about the importance of Milanese infantry already in the 11th century, for example. In Carcano we have, first of all, there's the interesting aspect, the infantry operating separated from cavalry, which was not really a good recipe for, especially allowing for a combined armed tactics. However, there were some points. In that case, what happens is that the infantry was sent forward. There was also like a general antipathy between cavalry and infantry for political reasons in the commune. There are also social, so there are all kinds of aspects we will have to comment on better in another video for this operational detachment. But essentially, these Lombards were advancing against the imperial forces, and the infantry is caught up in the open by enemy cavalry, which overwhelms it. However, interestingly enough, this infantry reforms after having been broken and goes on to successfully loot the imperial camp, which tells you what kind of cohesion and kind of esprit de corps it had, kind of high moral quality it had. It was absolutely not normal by the second half of the 12th century to see infantry even taking on cavalry. Here we're talking about commoners at large. Yes, there would be, like as we've seen for the Normans, the heavier elements in the front ranks that would be the tactical equivalent of dismounted knights. Especially the Lombards had the finest heavy infantry out there. They were very rich. Their communal infantry was very well equipped. But here it's the moral force that is striking more than else. The cavalry, by the way, is defeated also by imperial cavalry. At Legnano, as you know, things are different. It's mostly like the importance of the battle in a broader political sense, but essentially the infantry, the Lombard cavalry is broken, and imperial by the cavalry, and which goes on and takes on the Lombard infantry. And this Lombard infantry is resisting to the imperial cavalry charges until some cavalry reinforcements arrived, because these Lombard armies were mostly coalition ones, so you had different detachments, different contingents coming from different cities to reunite, and so randomly the Brescians arrived. They also regroup some Milanese fugitives, and they arrive to support, in fact, the Milanese infantry that also passes to counterattack when their cavalry attacks the Imperials on the flanks. Frederick Barbarossa risks his life. He disappears for days after the rout, and he spawned back in Como, if I'm not wrong, his original basis for the Italian campaign, and that was such a disaster for the empire, in an international, for the Hohenstaufen, for this German attempt to curb Lombardy. That war also goes on for a while, but the Lombards win their rights at the Peace of Constance, and things will also develop further. We talked a lot about 13th, 14th century Italian communal armies that were arguably like the strongest, the most developed armies in medieval warfare. In any case, and that tells you more or less, like there are episodes in Flanders. We will talk about this in detail. They're not, however, such huge engagements. There are some cases in which definitely infantry takes on cavalry by itself, engages before cavalry does alone. The bigger engagements in that sense are in northern Italy, but it happens especially in Flanders. But we will see it outside of that, and now this was just anecdotal. At large, for the art of war, does you understand that the first half of the 12th century is mostly dictated by the cavalry now is so powerful. As a rising element, say we'll have to make more research about these topics because they're really interesting. By the early 12th century, we've seen infantry has still the capacity to take on cavalry, and this happens also because cavalry dismounts more frequently, and so that fully feudal military system is not there yet. From the second half of the 12th, that fully kicks in, but at the same time you have the infantry growing, and this is a bit the prerogative of Western civilization. It doesn't really choke autonomies even when the feudal element grows, which tells you a lot really about the West compared to, say, I don't know, the Byzantine or the Arab worlds are much more sclerotic in many ways. We're not talking about the Turco-Mongol one that is basically just destroying rather than creating, and so there is so much actually about this military history that is worth being considered state by state. the sometimes there are optical distortions. For example, I found some scholars, or at least some relative experts, that were stating that, for example, the later 100 Years' War English preference to fight dismounted would have stemmed from some kind of continuity also in the 12th century, as we've seen today, with foot combat present in England as a northern European country as opposed to France. In my opinion, I haven't seen this. Like in the 13th century, England has basically the same identical armies that other Western countries have. And it may be that, it's difficult to explain. Maybe England was at times also a smaller system, also one that had to cross the channel in order to fight in France. So the fact of having, for example, smaller troops, cheaper ones in the form of missile, would have brought, as we've seen, to the 100 Years' War reality, where they mostly had to defend rather than and hoping to survive, because they were in pretty bad circumstances. The sense here being, however, also that they had learned something from the importance of especially missile against static infantry formations, like almost infantry-only armies that are not a positive thing. In fact, especially if we consider combined arms tactics at this point, that are the Scottish ones. They didn't have even too many archers in their kind, which you would think, well, maybe if Scotland was poor, they had more archers to field even just. No, because as we've seen, it's better to actually have heavy infantry. The English in that sense had knights and lots of archers, plus of course heavy infantry on their own, but not such determined and sturdy heavy infantry like the Scottish Schiltrans that were there just to stand their ground or die because they didn't have any greater maneuverability. Their infantry sometimes did maneuver pretty well, but it's not like again, I mean, the English were a much more complete military system. So in my opinion, the sense that there was an English way distinguished from the others to fight, etc., does not explain really what the broader balance that you see there would have been about, right? And on the contrary, I believe that the English were very advanced military-wise in these centuries, to the point of mostly in a doctrinal sense they didn't lack anything, right? And just a bit more of material poverty in some areas, having more sort of traditional ways of war, have nothing to do with the actual development of their overall military system. That's the impression I personally received. Also because it doesn't make any sense to consider a successful military system so because it was backward. The English fought in pretty direct ways against the Scots, the French. We have to still look at in depth at the entire military age of Edward III. We made a video about the Battle of Poitiers with the Black Prince. I was amazed. It's honestly one of the most beautiful battles that I've ever studied. It's so complete. It's so straightforward, magnificent. That was also the masterpiece of the Black Prince. So honestly, there is so much about this that you still have to be mostly patient about, and that is mostly connected to our understanding of warfare and how this whole thing worked. And again, at large, I think that this interpretation is correct. I've never found it elsewhere. I think it's the most balanced. I think it's the most obvious in many ways, but people prefer to stick to the longbow destroyed everything, was better than the crossbow, and let's just pray for the death of the last neurons that that pass away. before such statements. In any case, Schwerpunkt is made to look at all these aspects in depth. I'm actually very satisfied by the fact that we already made so many videos about medieval infantry. I have an entire playlist, if I'm not wrong. Let me check. Surely we talked already about 13th century infantry just per se. And this is just, think, the military, we said this all and only for a generic military historical unit episode, right? Not even for the bigger picture. Let's search for infantry. I do not actually have a medieval infantry. Ah, yes, I do. Medieval infantry warfare. It seems strange, in fact. 39. This is the 40th video. Well, not bad. This is old medieval infantry, by the way. It's not like there is more than much elsewhere. Yeah. And yeah, we're looking at, I meant also that video about the Crusader infantryman, 11th, 13th century, the medieval bow. This one I liked very much. One of the videos I liked the most, Riding into Hell, the constant nightly awareness of infantry potential. This is almost 4 hours of videos, like 3 hours and a half into videos. We talked about the medieval Spanish heavy infantrymen of the 11th century. We talk about Welsh infantry in different ages, including this one. Western Frankish crossbowmen, late 13th century English infantry. It's one of the earliest videos by Schwerpunkt. It's not too much, actually. We talk about the feared men, the select feared men. We talk about the medieval Polish infantry of more or less this time as well. But it's not, as you understand, so complete, right? There is always more to say. And yeah, especially regarding the historical military units, we will look at many of them, even though, again, the infantry is in many ways less distinctive than crossing out the dismounted knights. What else to say? Well, not much really. This is what we had to cover. The channel is faring relatively well. It's expanding, it's growing, so I don't see any issue at large. You should perhaps be a bit more there, but I know that there are things going on, like the world is crazy, you have to work, whatever. But I mean, especially sharing somewhere, like making this promotion of the channel is always useful. And the more we are, the more this thing goes on. That's the most important thing of all. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.